Hi, this is Eliza Inkberry with Darkside University, and I am doing Gothic Gardening's design principles for garden design. And this is the segment on proportion and scale. This is a nice little article that kind of talks about the psychological space that we have around us and why scale matters for humans aesthetically. So if you're interested in going into even more detail about it, then you may be interested in reading this. Again, if you just look up here at the website link, you can find that. And this is my front yard, and it's a good example of scale because when I first bought the house, this is what you see going on here is me putting in hugelkultur keyhole beds in the front yard in kind of a half mandala garden. This is not filled in yet, but you can kind of see that there are little keyholes all the way around, so I can get to each part of the garden and reach everywhere and weed everything. And then this horseshoe shape in the middle has a larger round spot and then a thinner path right here, and it's been filled in now with mulch so you don't see all this bare space, and now it's filled in with plants as well, so it's really hard to photograph. But originally when I bought the house, there were so many trees in the front yard that you could barely see the house at all. There was a full-sized eastern red cedar over here. This dogwood has since been taken out. There was another dogwood, and there was a grand magnolia right here, a southern grand magnolia. And I don't know if you can tell how small this is, but when the magnolia was going to reach full size, you would no longer be able to get to the front door probably. It's not a very big yard, and so I took that magnolia out to the chagrin of my neighbors because magnolias are sacred to Southerners. And I understand why. They're a beautiful tree, but if they're in the wrong place, that's the thing about scale is that you need to think about how much space you have. You might be able to pull off a miniature magnolia, but a full-size grand magnolia is going to eat your house if it's something this size. And you can't see my house in this picture, but it's just a two-bedroom house. It's not something very grand to go with the magnolia, but if I had had more property, then it wouldn't have been a problem. And so this is another example of scale. And scale doesn't have to be with trees. It could be with the kind of arbor you're going to do. If you have a very tiny house and you do this really large grape arbor all the way across the front, then that's going to look out of scale. So basically it's showing you can probably look at these and get kind of a psychological sense of how you feel when you look at each one. And maybe you prefer this. Maybe you like the idea of being nestled into a little forest. Maybe you prefer this. Maybe this makes it feel open and savanna-like to you, and you could use all of that space and having a sunny garden. So scale is also a matter of opinion, and some people will kind of dogmatically say that certain things are correct or not, but they're wrong. It's basically down to what you want. At some point, someone really wanted all those trees in my front yard, and I feel like I'm leaving one of them out. Oh, there's a redbud, a massive, like the largest redbud I've ever seen, and you couldn't see it in that photograph, but it kind of hangs over that front area as well, and another dogwood tree kind of on the other side where there's only about a 10-foot extra space. So yeah, there were a lot of trees in the front yard. And so this is an example of kind of a out of scale tree in a front yard. You can see there's not very much space here, but frankly, this is a lemon tree, and if that was all the sun I had, I would do it too. So it's kind of up to you what you mind, like if you mind having a tree totally blocking your window or not. If the lemons are more valuable to you than, say, what Americans consider curb appeal. And I feel like these people have done a lot to make their yard look well cared for and loved, even if it's not everyone's aesthetic. This is something to keep in mind. It's the rule of thirds, and it's when you have a ratio of 1 to 2. to try to decide how much space to put between features. And it's something that I kind of do intuitively. I don't measure it out very often, but you might want to if it's something that you feel uncomfortable with. And you can look up the rule of thirds ratio online if you want to kind of get some more examples of that. Um, and this is something that I feel like was nicely to scale. I'm just using a few small examples here. Large pots, people tend to be kind of shy about using really large pots, and you'll see sometimes where someone will have a pot sitting in the garden or on their patio, and it'll be really tiny and it kind of gets lost and people don't notice it. So sometimes it's worth spending the money or making it yourself, getting or recycling something to make a larger potted feature that's going to stand out. Although I will say I don't particularly care for using pots with this kind of curve to it unless I'm only putting annuals in, because I don't like putting a perennial in something that I can't easily pop it out of at the end of the season and trim up the roots if necessary. Like with citrus, you're basically sort of doing bonsai techniques to it to keep it as a small tree. Not entirely, you're not keeping it that tiny, but every once in a while you're going to need to prune the roots and prune the top to keep it small enough that you can move it around. If you're in a climate where you have to bring your citrus indoors for the winter to make sure it's safe and growing healthily, then that's the case. So, if you've got something that you're going to overwinter indoors, then a pot with a curved edge like this is less desirable than one that's got straight edges, so it will just pop right out. But large pots, don't be shy using them in the landscape. And so here you have a water feature. Like this water feature is pretty big, so I'm assuming that this property is fairly large. You could see in the background there's some pretty large trees. And then this one, there's a pretty big wall right here, but this could be kind of a small backyard area. It doesn't necessarily have to be big, but as far as scale goes, it's a smaller one than that last one. And then this one is pretty tiny comparatively, and you could do this in an even smaller little courtyard or something. Cauldrons are kind of a popular water feature, but you can use any kind of container and set it up to become a water feature. And this one is even tinier still. It's just a rock with a slight depression in it, and there would be a basin under these rocks, and the water would get recycled back through. The more splash you have, the more you're going to have to replace the water in a water feature like this. So if you don't want to have to replace it very often, you can come up with ways for it to get fed from your landscape, from rainwater collection, or you can reduce the splash so it's not evaporating as quickly. Um, and so here's another to scale. To do a kind of big maze garden like this, it would be very cramped and kind of out of proportion in a very tiny yard. But if you have a large yard, you could do something like this. And this happens to be a rose garden in addition to a maze. Arbors, if you have a very tiny garden, then you're probably not going to want to use a really large one or multiple ones. And the same thing with trellises. You don't want to use something that's so tiny it disappears. And this one I think is a really good example of scale, because if you were to put this sculpture out in that broad landscape somewhere, you probably wouldn't even see it. Like imagine if it was, say, right there. You'd just see this little dark blot on the horizon. But I'm assuming because of this concrete bit that maybe there's a patio right over here. So scale wise and proportion wise, it's closer to you, so it looks larger. And so if you're sitting in a chair right here, then you're going to see this silhouette against this landscape, and you're going to notice that statue more. So sometimes placement has to do with how close it is to the house or how far away it is, in addition to what size it is. And that's my lesson on scale and proportion. This is week 4, and I'm looking forward to talking to you in chat.